So my masking fluid is completely dry. So for this particular one, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to cover the entire back with antique linen distress refill. Now, I'm doing this because I want the background to have a vintagey look to it. You certainly don't have to. There is, it gets vintagey enough just with inking the outside once we're done to create some dimension. But this is just to show you what they look like with it and without it. So that is all inked. I don't need my wide brush anymore. You could do it with a narrow brush, but you're gonna have an easier time getting the entire surface done quicker with a wide brush. While that's wet, I'm gonna go in with some gathered twigs here, and I'm just doing my shadow underneath my greenery. And this is easiest to do while your background is wet, because you're gonna get just nicer gradation from the shadow to just the inked background. Much easier to blend it out while the background is wet, and you're not gonna get any harsh lines. There we go. All right, so we have everything shadowed that I want. So I'm gonna let that dry completely, and then we're gonna paint in the image. All right, my background is completely dry, so we are going to watercolor our image. So I'm gonna first do the red, and I'm using Festive Berries. And what I'm painting with is distress reinkers. They're meant to reink distress pads, but I like using them for watercoloring because I already have them for my pads. And because they are a dye ink, they will work for watercoloring. And I always love it when one product does more than one thing. So the first thing I'm doing is Santa's jacket here, and you'll notice that I'm brushing the excess off of my brush onto the paper towel. And I keep my inks in a little palette here. I've got them all labeled so I know what colors where. I do a fair amount of watercoloring with them, so I find it handy to have it ready to watercolor anytime I want to. If you didn't watercolor so much, you could use a non-porous surface, a container, lid, oh, we gotta do the berries too, or just a piece of plastic or whatever. You don't necessarily have to have a dedicated palette, but because I do this often, I find it handy to have one at the ready any second. So for the berries, I am going around the outside with the darkest of the colors, and I'm doing a couple berries at a time. And then I'm tapping the excess off on my paper towel, and then I'm just blending in the center. And that way I get a nice section that's a little bit lighter, kind of like where the light would hit. And I find 2 is about a good number to do with this. I wouldn't want to do too many because I don't want the paint to dry and end up having a ring around my berries there. Two more to go. And if you find there's an area like this one here doesn't really have too much of a dark shade in it, I can go back and add a little bit while it's still wet without having to worry about harsh lines in there. I am going to do my pine here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do some very watery of my pine needles color. And I'm just trying to get a layer behind so that this is all green. So then when I go in after this is dried a little bit and add a little bit of texture on top, I still have some green underneath, so it's not gonna look like I've missed some spots. And I don't need to be super perfect with this, but what I am doing, you'll notice my brush is pointed towards the stem, and then I'm brushing the color out. I'm blending the color out, because I don't necessarily want it to be a big blob here. I want the color to be in the center, and then just out, and just have a light amount of color behind it. And I think that red has dried enough that I can paint beside it. If your red is still wet, you want to wait until this is completely dry, because if I go do this right beside the red and it's still wet, it's just they're going to seep into each other. So you want to make sure to wait to do this part until the red is dry enough so that it's not going to blend. And then these ones here, there's not really a bunch of greenery there. There's just a few pines on there. So I'm just going to use my brush and going from the center out. I'm just adding some color there. One spot here that I missed. There we go. So I'm going to let that dry for a moment while I do my holly. And I'm going to do my holly in peeled paint. Typically, while I'm painting, if I'm wondering about a color, I will put it on a little scrap of watercolor paper, just so that I can see what the color looks like, to see if that's the color that I'm wanting to use. After you've used the medium for a while, you kind of get to know what's your favorite colors for certain things. And peeled paint is one of my favorite ones for greenery, because it's a little bit more natural looking. So I started in the center and worked my way out, and I found it got a little bit too light in the center, so I can go back and add a little bit more of that same color. And you can blend it out a little bit, but because the whole leaf is wet, it will naturally just blend out a little bit. There we go. Now I'm going to do some gathered twigs here, and I'm going to do the branch on the pine needles, and I'm also going to do the branch on the berries there. So I'm doing gathered twigs. I don't know if I actually said it. Sometimes it's you've said something in your mind but not actually out loud. I'm just doing it lightly because I've already got the stamped image there. I don't want it to be super dark and harsh, but I do want to enhance that line a little bit. And I tend to shy on the lighter side for this. You can always go in and add and make that brown darker, but once it's dry, it's a little bit harder to lighten it up too much. You could do it to an extent, but you wouldn't be able to lighten it up a lot. And that green is likely still slightly damp, and what that's going to do, it's going to soften the lines on that little branch there. All right, now let's get some black soot here and give him some black gloves there. And I just realized I didn't do the red in the candy cane. So once this is done, we'll go back and do that. So the one thing with these re-inkers and these palettes though is you need to make sure you keep them horizontal. You can't tilt them up because the inks actually never dry on them. So if you were to tilt them up, they would end up just running. So you want to make sure to keep in mind that when you're storing them. There we go. And now I'm going to go back to those pine needles again. And this time I'm doing it a little bit darker. And I'm following the lines on the stamp and just doing little strokes. I want to actually see some needles. I don't want it to be one big blob of green. So I do want to be able to see some of those strokes there. And because this is the same color that's underneath, it's not going to be super bright and dark and in your face. It's going to be a little bit more subtle because it's the same color. But once this is dry, we're going to go back in with the pine or the peeled paint and just bring out some of those needles. And I always tap the brush on my paper towel just to get some of the excess water out. find it's best to err on the side of caution and not necessarily get too much paint on your piece all at once. You'll notice how that's where I started there, how it's just kind of blended right into everything there. All right, so I'm gonna let that dry for a few seconds. I am going to take Tattered Rose and paint Santa's face because I like that for a skin color, although that one was far too dark, so I need to lighten it up. While it's still wet, I can take the excess off of my brush and then lighten it up right on the piece there. And then I am going to paint the ornament. Now to add a little bit of sparkle, I'm going to do the ornament in Perfect Pearls. Now Perfect Pearls are a mica powder, but they have a binding agent in them that is activated by... Well, that's awkward. I ran out of space on my phone and didn't actually notice. So I went back in with the pine needles and did a second coat with them, but just used my brush to get some brush strokes in there so we have a little bit of the pine needles. And the other thing that I've done is I'm using Perfect Pearls and painting the ornament so that it's golden shimmery. Now Perfect Pearls are a mica powder, but they have a binding agent in them that is activated by water, so you can make a shimmer paint out of them. So that's what I did here. I just put a little bit in here and I mixed it up with water and I have a shimmer paint. So I'm gonna let that completely dry. And what we're actually gonna do once everything is dry is we're going to put some glossy accents over it to make it nice and shiny as well. Last step before I let this dry some more is I'm going to go back over here with my peeled paint color, and I'm going to go once more and give to the pine needles because I want to make sure that you can see individual needles in there. I don't want it to be a big green blob. And if I were to go over it again for a third time with the same color, we would just have a bunch of the same color and you wouldn't actually necessarily see the individual needles. So as I'm doing this, I'm just following the lines from the stamp to do this. And this is exactly what I did with the pine needles for the second layer of this. But this time I'm doing peeled paint. A little bit in there so it looks like the same branch and not a completely different branch. All right, there we go. So I'm gonna let that completely dry. Once it's dry, we'll be ready to assemble our card and then add the extra accents on top. We'll see you in a bit.